Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third session in our series entitled Not Okay. My name is Steve Robinson, and I serve as the pastor of Church of the King. You know, we all want to live a life filled with peace and purpose. The problem is, these are crazy times we're living in. It's hard to know where to start amidst all of life's chaos. And these times can leave you feeling anxious and even fearful. Today, we're going to look at time and stress management. Look, I get it. My schedule can get pretty crazy. I try to look at my calendar for the week on Sunday night, but it can get overwhelming with so many responsibilities, changes, and even family needs. How about you? Do you feel like your schedule and the demands on your life are pushing you over the edge? I think we could all raise our hands and say, Steve, I could use a little extra time in my life. I just can't seem to get it all done in the 24 hours. Well, let's start today by looking at the Apostle Paul's encouragement in Ephesians chapter 5. In this passage, Paul speaks of the importance of time. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15 through 17. Here's what it says. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Let's look at two key phrases in this passage. First, Paul called Christians to live very careful, not as unwise, but as wise. In life, we are to make the most of every opportunity. You and I are to seek God's wisdom about what we should do and the priorities we should set each day, week, month, and so forth. The second phrase that's so important here is making the most of every opportunity. You see, Paul is telling us let's value every minute of our lives. Let's not waste time on unimportant things, but let's consider what's important and give ourselves to it. Every moment counts. If we don't properly manage our time and the opportunities we have, we live stressed. I know I do. If we don't properly manage the stress, the quality of our entire life diminishes greatly, and we end up not okay. You see, in America, we are one nation, hold on, listen, one nation under stress. The majority of Americans have excessive stress in their lives, and studies continue to find that the percentage of Americans who feel under a great deal of stress, it's rising each year. And because of excessive stress, we are at epidemic levels of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, sleep disorders, especially insomnia, and headaches. We often say, I'm stressed out. But what does that really mean? You see, stress is the pressures of life and how one perceives, believes, reacts, and copes with those pressures. You see, all forms of stress produce a very well documented physical reaction in the body. In one sense, a certain level of stress is good, and it actually causes you to grow in life. Think of going to a gym. I mean, a certain amount of weight on the bar, it causes you to grow physically. In the same way, a certain amount of stress in life helps you to develop emotionally and mentally. Okay, we've all heard that long-term stress, though, is bad for us. I'm talking about that chronic long-term stress that beats you down. We've all heard of adrenaline and what happens in our body when we live under long-term stress. It's very destructive. So, why do we continue to live this way? Why don't we naturally recognize the dangers of excessive chronic stress, the stress that tears you down, that weighs you down? Well, the answer is quite simple. When stress comes, adrenaline increases in our body. We get that rush, and it temporarily makes us feel good. And honestly, many people are simply addicted to it. Elevated adrenaline levels give us a heightened sense of well-being, increased energy, a reduced need for sleep, and feelings of excitement. See, we can easily think that an adrenaline surge is good for us because it feels good, but only temporarily. That's why it's so addicting. The feelings of security that adrenaline provide can give us a dangerously false sense of well-being. And let me tell you something, I get it. I enjoy the rush of adrenaline. And I have to be careful to not live for a project after project and series after series and thing and accomplishing and building and let's build something, let's do something. So I have to be careful that the adrenaline that comes from excessive stress, that I don't get hooked on that myself. I struggle with that in my life. And that's why this message is so important. See, building things and expanding for all of you business people, all of you, it's great. But you have to be careful because you can get over-adrenalized. That's not healthy. Maybe you can relate to what I'm talking about. So if we're going to live healthy, that's what we're talking about, and live a long life, if we're going to have to learn then how to maximize our time and opportunities while managing our stress and our adrenaline. Today, let's learn some biblical principles for maximizing time while limiting life stressors. If we will gain understanding in these three key areas, listen, we all need this. We'll all see our lives change for the better, and we'll find the calm that we're desperately seeking. All right, you guys ready? I want you to follow along with your small group. This is going to be a very good discussion afterwards. So important. Number one, we've got to understand the principle of margin. See, every one of us is designed by God with limits, capacities, and boundaries that we are to function within. The Apostle Paul understood this when he wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. Here's what he said. We, however, will not boast beyond measure, but within there's that word, limits of the sphere which God appointed us. A sphere which especially includes you. What is Paul saying? I'll tell you what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, I know my sphere. I know my limitations. In other words, I know my boundaries, and I don't want to go beyond that because things begin to break down. In other words, Paul understood he had limits. Paul didn't go beyond his God-given assignment and limitations. Now, I want everyone in the small group, everyone follow along with me. I want you to repeat something after me if you feel comfortable. All right, this is important. Say, I am human. Humans have limits. Therefore, I have limits. Another word for limits here is our capacity. Friends, our capacity is our God-given emotional, mental, physical, and even spiritual abilities. We all have different capacities. The Bible talks about this. One has 2, one has 5, different capacities, different abilities. And we all have limits attached to those. So we have a limit, but we also have a load. And I want to talk about that. Remember, we're talking about margin. Our load is our responsibilities, our tasks, our challenges, and our duties we carry through life. So we all have a load and we all have a limit. The difference between our limit and our load, what we're carrying, is margin. You see that? If our load exceeds our limit, we are marginless. If our limit exceeds our load, we have margin. In other words, we have excess capacity. In other words, we're not breaking down. In other words, we can sleep good at night. In other words, we have a joy in our soul. We're not burning out. The conditions of modern day living, they devour margin. Now, here's one practical principle to help you build margin into your life. Learn to say no to the many good things so we can say yes to the best things. Everyone say no. Say it. Ready? 1, 2, 3. No. It's probably the first word you ever learn, yet some of us forget how to use it when we grow up. And that's when we really need it. It may be turning off the screens at night or during the day. Do you know studies are finding Americans are spending over 28 hours per week in front of an entertainment screen, whether TV or playing games or on your phone, surfing online, Instagram, whatever it is, social media, 28 hours per week. What if we turned the time we used in front of a screen into productivity, connecting relationally, or in other ways to invest in healthy living? Maybe you need a technology boundary. Perhaps you get on social media maybe for 15 minutes in the morning to keep you in touch, right? But then you put it down the rest of the day. Personally, I've had a lot of opportunities in my life as a pastor. I've had a lot of opportunities to be on church boards and other nonprofit boards and other things, all right? But I know that I've got limits. Now, I didn't always know that. 10 years ago, when I burned out, what happened is I had more load than limit. So now I'm realizing, wait a minute, I've got a certain limit. And that's hard. By the way, that's hard to acknowledge, isn't it? For type A personalities, you've got limits. It's okay. Don't have more load than your limit. Remember, you and I have a certain capacity. I had to learn to say no. I can't do everything. All right, so number one, we've got to understand the principle of margin. Number two, we're talking about time management and lowering the stressors so that we can maximize God opportunities, right? Not so we can sit around and be lazy, but we want capacity to maximize our time. The way we do that is we understand margin. And number two, we've got to understand the principle of seasons, all right? The wisest man to ever live, King Solomon, wrote this to us in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 to 3. Listen to what he said. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. What Solomon's saying is there is an ebb and flow to life. There'll be busy seasons and there'll be slow seasons. There'll be building seasons and there'll be times to cut back. You and I can't live in harvest time all the time. There's planting and there's harvesting. In the spring, you plow and plant. In the summer, you water and it grows. Then in the fall, you reap. In the winter, well, there's dormancy. Yet things are still happening then. In other words, there's seasons in the agricultural world. God has built that principle into our earth. So you may be asking, Pastor, what about the whole concept of balance? I hear a lot about balance. Well, I think the whole balance thing can get a little bit misplaced for one reason. Balance doesn't take into account seasons. For example, maybe you're starting a business. Well, that's a lot of output. Getting married, it's a lot of change. Having a baby, right? Try telling your wife, honey, you know what? I'm in a busy season. You take care of the newborn for the next 6 weeks. I'll say, no. That's a season, right? You guys are in this together, okay? Maybe building a house. Whoa, that is a lot of output. Studying for your exams. Doctors, those of you that are in clinicals, whatever it is. In other words, there are seasons of tremendous output. Others of you, you're in a different place. Maybe the kids are grown. You're in the twilight years of your career. You've got different capacities. Make sure whatever season you're in that you keep God at the center of your life and you allow Him to direct you in all that you do. Okay, so what are we talking about today? We're talking about how to lower our stress and maximize our time. Well, how do we do that? Paul talks about be wise, be careful. We don't just let life happen to us. We're intentional with our lives. And there's three principles to increasing our ability to maximize time. Number one, understanding margin. Number two, understanding the season that you're in. All right? Number three, understand your priorities. See, it's important to realize this message. It's not all about the mechanics of just time management. You guys can go get a time management calendar, and those are good, and I use them. But this is really about priority management. I want to encourage you today to schedule your time according to your priorities. Maybe it's a little bit of a shift in your thinking. I believe most of us don't have a time problem. We do have a priority problem. We have great difficulty setting still long enough to write down our priorities and what we want to accomplish in our lives. Let me tell you what the result is. The result of that is that we live unintentional lives, that we often miss the mark, the goal, the fulfillment of the dream in our hearts. And after all, who doesn't want to have a thriving relationship with Jesus? Who doesn't want to have a healthy relationship with your spouse, your kids, your friends? Who doesn't want to be physically, mentally, and emotionally strong? Who doesn't want to be reasonably prosperous with enough to meet your own needs and more than enough to share with others? We all want that. The problem, though, it's not our desire. It's often our lack of a plan. The Apostle Paul models a life of intentionality, as we see in Philippians chapter 3, verse 14. Listen to what he says. I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. In other words, this verse encourages us to move towards a goal. Paul had a goal, to know Christ and to make him known. And by the way, he lived intentionally with a vision, with a goal that he had. The top of our priority list should be our spiritual life, our relationship with God. So in other words, are we committing time to that priority? How are we developing spiritually? How are we doing in our word time, in our prayer time, in our time with other believers, attending church, different areas, serving other people? How are we doing in that? See, that's the most important priority. But if we have our priorities and we don't allocate time towards that, question, is it really a priority? If we make sure to keep our relationship with God as our number one priority, then He can guide us in how to handle and prioritize the other area of our lives. Trust me, God knows what's best. You know, as I've approached, actually I've now gone past my 50s, but as I came into my 40s and I went through that time, I was 41 when I burned out, 10, now really 11 years ago, 2000, almost 12. I came out of that and I began to live differently. I began to live according to a life plan and priorities. And I realize now at my age over my 50s, I realize that my runway, it's getting shorter. So I want to maximize my opportunities. It's no time for me just to waste, but it's a time for me to live intentionally, to invest in my relationship with God, with my spouse, with my children, in the vocation that God's called me to walk in and to pastor Church of the King and the responsibilities there. But here's the point. In order to live an intentional life, we need a tool to help us discern our priorities and our God-given goals. Do you have one? Well, I use what's called a life plan. And life plans start with looking at and establishing our goals and our priorities in writing. Now, a friend of mine who coached me, he was a life coach to me years ago after my burnout, Daniel HARKAVY, has written a great book. It's called Living Forward. I do not recommend a lot of books, okay? I always recommend the Bible. It's infallible. But, these other books we recommend, sometimes you may disagree with, so it's okay. But this is at least a start. It's a tool. My point is you need a plan. I want to encourage you. I think in your small group, there's some resources where direct you towards. If you want to pick that up, you can do that. In the end, I think people have a priority management problem more than a time problem. We all have the same amount of time. What if you and I were able to sit down, find the margin, understand the season we were in, and live out our priorities? Can you imagine what your life would look like in 2021? Can you imagine what it would look like at the end? The impact, the fulfillment, and the satisfaction that you would experience. Man, my prayer for you today in your small group is you enjoy this time, study together, grow together. I hope you guys are starting to join friendship and relationship. You need others for the journey in God. God bless you, and I'll see you next week.